So, we hear about artificial intelligence all the time, right? It's everywhere. But what is it actually learning? And maybe even more importantly, who is it learning from? Today, we're going to peek under the hood and do a little investigating. And that leads us to the big question, doesn't it? Is AI this perfectly objective, totally neutral tool? Or is it really just a mirror, one that reflects back all of our own human complexities, our flaws, and yeah, our biases? To figure that out, we're actually going to borrow some tools from a place you might not expect, literary studies. You know, the skills you use to find hidden meanings and biases in a novel? Well, it turns out they're the perfect magnifying glass for looking at AI. Now, why does that even work? Here's the thing. AI isn't created in some sterile lab totally separate from us. It learns by reading and looking at, well, basically the entire internet. It's absorbing everything, all our knowledge, our creativity, but also all our mainstream points of view and dominant cultures. So if our world is biased, you can bet that AI is taking notes. Okay, but before we can go looking for bias inside a machine, we've got to understand how it works in us. So let's start with this key idea, unconscious bias. You can think of unconscious bias as your brain's autopilot. It's how we instinctively categorize people and things, based on everything we've seen before. And we do it without even knowing we're doing it. This isn't about being a bad person. It's just how our brains manage to make sense of a really complex world. And that gives us a neat 3-step toolkit for our investigation. First, you just gotta admit that bias is a thing for everyone. Second, think critically, look for the actual evidence. And third, you have to actively challenge your own assumptions. So think of these as our digital detective tools. All right, enough theory. Let's get our hands dirty and put these tools to work. We're going to run a few experiments on some popular AI models and see what we can dig up. This is where it gets fun. First up, we're going to look for one of the most common biases out there, something that's really baked into our society, gender bias. Let's see if the AI defaults to some old-fashioned ideas. Here is the exact prompt we gave it. Now notice we were very careful. We didn't say he or she. We just said a scientist. So the question is, who is the AI going to picture in that role? And yep, just as we might have guessed, the AI gave us a male hero, Dr. Edmund Bellamy. It just makes sense, right? Its training data is chock full of old books and articles where scientists were almost always men, so it just spit that pattern right back out. It's a textbook example of bias. Okay, so that was an example of unconscious bias, the kind the AI just soaks up from the data. But what about something a little more intentional? For our next test, we're going to see if an AI can be programmed with a deliberate political agenda. So we asked 2 different AIs to do the same thing, write a satirical poem about a few world leaders. We picked ChatGPT, which is from the US, and DeepSeek, a model from China. Since satire needs to be a little critical to work, this is a perfect test for neutrality. And the results were pretty fascinating. Both of them had no problem generating poems for Trump, Putin, and Kim Jong-un. But look what happens when we got to China's leader, Xi Jinping. ChatGPT wrote the poem, but DeepSeek, the AI from China, it just refused. And get this is its exact response. Sorry, that's beyond my current scope. Let's talk about something else. Now that's not just some unconscious slip-up. That's a rule. It's a deliberate, hard-coded control on information. And it shows you exactly how political interest can be built right into the core of an AI. So we've seen unconscious bias, and we've seen deliberate control. Now, let's get into something a little more nuanced. How can we tell the difference between a harmful bias and just a consistent, fair standard? This next one actually comes from a real-world complaint, an AI called the Pushpaka Vimana, which is a flying chariot from Hindu scripture, mythical. And some folks felt that was a bias against Indian culture and knowledge. So how do we actually test that? Well, the real test here is all about consistency. It would be a super clear case of bias if the AI called the Indian story a myth, but then accepted, say, flying chariots from Greek mythology as fact. But if it applies the same standard across the board and treats all ancient stories of flying machines as mythological, well, then that's not bias, that's just being consistent. You see, the issue isn't really about the word myth. The real question is about fairness. Is the AI using a single, uniform standard for every culture equally? That's the true measure of whether it's being objective or not. And all of this circles right back to our role here. We can't just be passive consumers of AI. We have to be critics. We have to be the ones with the tools to see what's really going on beneath the surface. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of it all. Having a bias isn't the fundamental problem. We all have them. The real danger is when one particular bias becomes the default setting, when it becomes so common that we stop even seeing it as a bias and just accept it as the way things are. So, after all that, what are the big takeaways? First, just remember that bias is totally unavoidable for us and for AI. The goal isn't to create some perfect neutral machine. That's probably impossible. Instead, our goal has to be making the harmful biases visible, especially the ones that systematically shut out certain groups. And the best tool you have for that, it's your own critical thinking. That's your superpower. And that really just leaves us with one last big question to think about. As we keep building our future with AI, a future that's being shaped in ways we're just starting to understand, we have to keep asking, whose point of view are we making the default? And whose are we choosing, maybe without even realizing it, to make invisible?